Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are in the world. My name is Kay Bailey Hutchison, and I'm the former U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO and a board director of the Atlantic Council. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to this Atlantic Council front page event, Allied Resolve. AC Front Page is the Atlantic Council's premier live ideas platform spotlighting global leaders who are innovating and championing constructive solutions to current global challenges. The Council prides itself on serving as NATO's home in Washington. So today's edition is particularly special as we welcome 4 former Secretaries General home. Unfortunately, the circumstances of today's event are not happy ones. Russia's war in Ukraine has completely changed the European security order. However, there is one organization uniquely suited to address this new challenge. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was founded in 1949 to assure collective security for its members. While it's most commonly known for its Mutual Defense Pact, the pledge that an attack on one is an attack on all. There's much more to NATO than that. NATO is the bedrock of transatlantic security. It is the longest and most successful political military alliance in history. By connecting North American and European security, we stand stronger as one. I saw this personally during my time as U.S. ambassador to NATO until this last year. I've witnessed countries from 30 nations come together to address the traditional defense and deterrence issues, of course, but also cybersecurity, climate change, human security, and more. I know that if there is one thing President Putin got wrong in his horrific invasion of Ukraine, it was underestimating the alliance, its constituent nations. In fact, the potential for 2 strong new members to join out of this crisis is a case in point. It is in this spirit of allied resolve that we've convened 4 individuals uniquely suited to share their insights into what NATO has done this far, what more it can do, and how this will change the security environment as we know it. From their time at the helm of the alliance, all 4 of the individuals with us today have steered the transatlantic community through their own share of crises. Today, they'll talk with us about their perspective on the war and what comes next from their perspective, leading NATO and their own national governments. Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome the former Secretaries General of NATO to the Council stage today. Mr. Anders Fogh Rasmussen of Denmark, Mr. Jaap Scheffer from the Netherlands, Lord George Robertson of the UK, and Dr. Javier Solana of Spain. Thank you all so much for being with us today in this unprecedented time for our shared security. Moderating this discussion is Jennifer Griffin, the national security correspondent at Fox News. I'm a fan of Jennifer's as she covers the Pentagon so well, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today as well. One housekeeping note that we must remember before we begin: if anyone in the audience online would like to join the conversation, please enter your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Or you can tweet them using the hashtag #ACFrontPage. With that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hutchison. I really appreciate that introduction, and I'm thrilled to be here with the AC Front Page group and our esteemed group of panelists. I began covering NATO from Brussels back during the Kosovo conflict. I've been here at the Pentagon for 15 years, and traveling back and forth to Brussels over those 15 years, there were always stories coming out: whither NATO, will NATO survive? And what strikes me today as we meet, it's day 112 since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO could not be more relevant. I'm seeing the headlines cross as we speak. The experts have been using the word Zeitenwende, or turning point, in describing this moment in the war in Ukraine. And as we speak, 50 nations are meeting in Brussels at NATO headquarters, hosted by the US Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, as part of the Ukraine Contact Group. That is, in essence, a weapons donor conference. And there was a very interesting interview this morning with the senior advisor to President Zelensky, Mikhail Polulak, who is the chief negotiator for Ukraine. And what was notable is that what he said they needed, he said, if there's one thing you take away from this interview, they need weapons, weapons, weapons. There was no talk of negotiations. I'd like to start with our panel, and I'd like to go around to each of the panelists and ask briefly to give examples of how you think what NATO could be doing politically, militarily. What should they be doing right now that could change the course of this conflict that they're not doing? I would like to start with Mr. Rasmussen, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Yes, I think it's very clear that NATO allies should do much more to provide aid to the Ukrainians, to deliver what the Ukrainians need. And here and now, it is more heavy weapons, including long-range artillery. The Ukrainians have the will to fight. We must give them the means to fight. They are fighting on behalf of all of us for freedom and democracy. Politically, NATO allies could also do much more. First of all, we could strengthen deterrence. We could make our deterrence much more credible by keeping all options on the table. To my mind, many NATO leaders have been too eager to exclude this or that action. I think we should keep our adversary in uncertainty. That's the most efficient deterrence. And NATO allies should not push Ukraine into a bad peace. It's only for the Ukrainians. It's for President Zelensky and his government to decide the terms of a ceasefire or a peace deal. So all in all, NATO allies should provide unified, strong, ironclad support for Ukraine.
Lord Robertson, why is it taking so long to get weapons into Ukraine, and what is your assessment at this point?
There's obviously a logistical nightmare involved in getting things into Ukraine. It's, after all, it's a country at war and being targeted even in the West by Russian missiles. So we can't pretend that it is easy to do the reinforcement that is necessary and desirable. But the Allies have made it clear that they will supply the ammunition and the weapons that will be required to take on, the mass of the Russians that are there. And I think that that's something that needs to be accelerated. We also need to do training. May have to be outside of Ukraine, but we need to train some of the Ukrainians in the sophisticated weaponry that they are now being supplied with. And in terms of the battle they're fighting, training is absolutely essential. It's a citizens' army, by and large, supplementing their professional army. And training we can do, and we can do well. We also, and I echo what Anders has just said, we need to bolster our deterrence. We need strong messages to go to the Ukrainian people that we are supporting them and will continue to do so. But messages to the Kremlin very clearly that NATO is an alliance that doesn't do defeat, that NATO is an alliance that believes in deterrence and believes in Article 5. And I think the Russians need to know that Article 5 means Article 5, an attack on one nation is an attack on all. So that simple, clear message needs to get into that small group of people who are around President Putin at the present moment. And it's got to be clear, and it's got to be regular, and it's got to be relentless so that they know that we mean business.
Dr. Solana, what is NATO doing or not doing that you think could help change the course of this conflict? What is your recommendation?
I agree with what had been said by the two predecessors that have spoken before me. But I would like to say also that I think the manner in which we are handling the problem is probably the manner in which we could do it faster. I think that it's the first time that a response of that density so rapidly has been performed into a country which is not a member of NATO, and therefore I don't think we have to be complaining about how little we have done. We have done a lot. We have done a lot from the very beginning. We have helped as much as we can in days. We have sanctioned the leaders of Russia in days. The sanctions have been implemented, but it's very difficult, as Lord Robertson said, it's very difficult to deploy the weapons to a country which is at war. It's practically one place where you have to enter, which is the border of Poland. And within the border of Poland is not a very wide where you can enter with the weapons. But I think we have to maintain the concern in the public sphere. We have to continue talking about that, keeping that in the newspapers, so that the tension in the international community that is against Putin does not decrease. But I would like to say also that the failure of Putin is also very important. I mean, he didn't want a country, in this case Ukraine, enter into NATO. And by the time that we have the summit in Madrid, which is a couple of days, very likely we will have two more countries in NATO, and not two minor countries, but two serious countries, Finland and Sweden, adding 1,500 kilometers of the border that NATO will have with Russia. So we are doing a lot. It has to be done more. It has to be more rapidly. But the sense of direction, I don't think we have to change it.
Professor de Hoop Scheffer, what more could be done right now, politically, militarily?
Let me start by underlining what my colleagues have said, and let me make a remark on the absolute need and necessity of political cohesion. We should go on with the delivery of arms, but I think politically we might be at the fork in the road, and I see from time to time our leaders in NATO and in the European Union making comments which gives me the impression that they not always sing from the same hymn sheet. And that, of course, concerns the day after. We have one president of a sovereign and independent nation called Ukraine. His name is Zelensky. He is the one who is in the lead. And I think that speculation about what might be acceptable and what might not be acceptable, and a different internality, if that's the right English expression, between our leaders should be prevented. So I think the NATO summit, apart from all the other important topics, should show once again, and that's what Vladimir Putin has, of course, achieved, the unprecedented form of solidarity, not only in NATO, but also in the European Union. But we should keep it up. It's a horrible war. It is an invasion, and we should not accept that it is pushed to page 5, 6, or 7 by inflation and by other discussions going on in our societies and by an economic crisis. So we should keep it up. Sanctions, yes. Arms delivery, yes. Heavy weapons, yes. But please, on the basis of political solidarity. And that is, I think, still something we have not completely achieved. And I say again, that's relevant for NATO, but it's as relevant for the European Union, given the fact that the toolbox of the European Union is better filled in measures like we have seen the sanctions packages. And as far as I'm concerned, the EU should make one extra step, at least one extra step, where it concerns sanctions after the oil package we saw a few weeks ago. So political cohesion is my key word, and we should all work for that, and it will not come by itself. If you're living in Poland or living in the Baltic states, the threat is perceived differently than when you live in The Hague or in Madrid or in Rome, for that matter. Thank you.
Let me follow up on that, Professor. What would you do? You've been Secretary General, you've all been Secretary General. What would you do? What leverage do you have to keep the unity? The unity has been natural for the first 100 days of the war, but now you're starting to see it fray in some ways. What could be done to hold the NATO alliance together? Is it too unwieldy at this point? Is it too big?
I don't think it's too big. I mean, NATO has proven since the 24th of February that NATO can stand behind one single position. The Americans have shown leadership. Thank them for that. But the European allies finally have realized that their geopolitical holiday is over. And we have seen, I repeat, unprecedented solidarity in NATO. What our leaders should do, and that's something for a summit and the confidentiality of a summit, and not in public, I repeat, not in public, not in front of the screens, but behind the screens, is have the courage to realize that we are in the fork in the road, and we should not see within the NATO alliance, and by definition inside the European Union, political leaders going different directions, because time is running out for Ukraine, and we have to show our solidarity and our support for Ukraine militarily, yes, but also giving the Ukrainians and President Zelensky the impression that we are politically one. I repeat, in NATO and inside the European Union, and not in the media. I see too many leaders appearing in media again with a different approach politically, and that, as I said, is then about the day after, the long term.
Lord Robertson, the addition of Finland and Sweden to NATO, it really is the most significant change in European security and its architecture since the Central and Eastern European countries joined. What is it that Finland and Sweden will bring to NATO militarily?
They bring a lot militarily. Finland, which has been the neighbor of Russia for all these years, has got a very sophisticated all-of-nation concept of resilience, and its part-time army and its professionals combined together to be a formidable force. So they will add very much to what NATO has to offer, and so indeed does Sweden. Both Sweden and Finland have been part and parcel of each and every one of NATO's operations in the past. So they're not strangers to NATO, and they've been strong supporters of NATO in the NATO-EU meetings that have taken place. Now, I've sort of joked recently that I spent 4 years, my term, trying to persuade Sweden and Finland to join NATO. Vladimir Putin managed it in 4 weeks. And now they're going to be part of this great alliance. I think it's a huge step forward and a total renunciation of what Vladimir Putin set out to do. His objectives of dividing America from Europe failed, divide Europe failed, stop NATO enlargement failed again. So each of these objectives he has spectacularly failed on, and I really optimistic about both Finland and Sweden joining in this alliance and adding not only military capabilities as they will, but also a political dimension and political knowledge that will be invaluable in the way that NATO operates politically. And we must always remember that NATO is not just a military alliance. Indeed, it is much more a political alliance, and they will add very substantially to that strength.
In fact, I've heard that each of their militaries are better than almost half of the alliance. I mean, these are very sophisticated militaries that will be joining. Dr. Solana, what do you think will be Putin's reaction?
Well, it's very difficult to think what Putin will be the reaction. I think that the moment in which these two countries are part of NATO, will be little reaction for meaningful for the side of Putin. NATO will be stronger. In northern part of Europe will be stronger vis-a-vis Russia. Therefore, whatever he thinks he may do, it will be something that it will not have consequences, real consequences. I think we maintain the solidarity. We're going to have a summit in a couple of weeks. You follow the index of what the topics we are going to be dealing with. It is very impressive what is going to come out of this summit. And that it will be read carefully by President Putin and his team. It will be read by all the leaders of the world who still have doubts about this war is a fair war or is not. And I think we have to keep talking to other countries who have not joined us in the United Nations. And there are many or several that they didn't do the significance of the vote, and now they will prefer to. I mean, they give the opportunity to have another vote if the United Nations does want. But I am very optimistic about the role, as has been said by Lord Robertson, of Finland and Sweden. Finland is probably the most prepared country in NATO, not in NATO, but he's going to be in NATO, but he was a member of the European Union already, the best prepared country vis-a-vis defending his border. No other country has lived that experience of here 5 kilometers of a border with Russia since 1945. So these two countries are countries that were neutral. They thought that neutrality was possible, and they end up saying that neutrality with what you have in Russia, somebody like President Putin, is not a choice.
Mr. Rasmussen, we've just seen headlines cross that Russia is claiming to have struck with missiles today, a NATO warehouse filled with weapons. This comes as the 50 nations are meeting in Brussels to talk about more weapons to Ukraine. Is this simply a warning shot, or should NATO be concerned? How is Putin going to react not only to Finland and Sweden joining NATO, but also to talk of sending more weapons? How seriously should the alliance be taking this shot across the bow, if you will?
Of course, we should take it seriously. It just shows that for a long time we have underestimated the brutality and the ambitions of Putin, who, by the way, has compared himself to Tsar Peter the Great. So we should not underestimate the challenges the Ukrainians are faced with. That's why we should continue to deliver weapons, and we should adapt to the new warfare by delivering higher caliber weapons, including long-range artillery. And we should never, ever give in to the threats or warning shots or whatever it might be from Putin. Because if we give in to that, we are playing his game. I could echo my colleagues by saying the message to Putin is very clear. Putin wanted less NATO. What he's got is more NATO.
Lord Robertson, how should NATO respond if Putin and Russia targeted a NATO warehouse of weapons today, even if it was inside Ukraine?
Well, first of all, we don't say what we would do. Ambiguity is the very basis of deterrence. I think that Vladimir Putin would be very cautious about hitting what would be seen as NATO targets even inside Ukraine and certainly outside of Ukraine. But we've made it clear that Article 5 is an absolute commitment by now the 30 members of the NATO alliance. So he knows that his country is in danger if he crosses the line that has been built into their military doctrine all along. But I don't think we should specify in advance what we will do. As I say, ambiguity is the very basis of deterrence. He needs to know that there would be consequences and they would be huge. And I think he knows that and his military know that as well.
Professor de Hoop Scheffer, is Putin bluffing when he talks about nuclear weapons?
Up till now, I think he is, and let me echo Anders. We should try to prevent that Putin thinks that our democracies have a sort of self-deterring mechanism. That's an important element in the whole discussion about deterrence. He should not get the opportunity from what we do or what we say, and that's why ambiguity indeed, George, is important. That we leave it how we would react, but make it sure that we would react. I mean, Putin, in my opinion, and I'll listen with interest to my colleagues. Putin is rational. Putin is rational, but his rationality is confined to his worldview. And his worldview most recently became even more clear than it was already to me when indeed he compared himself to Peter the Great, which means that after Ukraine, there's much more on the Putin menu, much more. When we give in now, I mean, look at Moldova, look at Georgia, where he has already 2 chunks since 2008. In other words, yes, the direct answer to your question is, I think he's bluffing. He will realize that if he makes one wrong move or puts one toe onto NATO territory, he's in big trouble. And that's why, indeed, I come again to my main point. That's why this political solidarity is so awfully important, that we show it, that NATO is a political military alliance in that order. And I think he's pretty sure of that, but the NATO summit is a good occasion to show that again. And again, after all, I'm a European. And Javier was also the high representative. What is relevant for NATO is also highly relevant for the 27 member states of the European Union, and for Great Britain, of course, not being a member, but thank heaven still a member of NATO. So for NATO and the European Union, it is of great importance. And I think Putin is bluffing. Let him bluff, but let him also realize that he is bluffing and that we will react very strongly and decisively if anything would happen.
Dr. Solana, do you agree that Putin is a rational actor at this point?
Well, I have my doubts. In principle, I have to assume that anybody who has power in a country is a rational human being. But if you look at the things that have taken place in the last period of time, it's questionable to say that he's acting rationally. When he tried to get Kiev at the beginning, he failed. He tried to put thousands of tanks and arms and trying to enter into in Ukraine. He failed. So I think the number of mistakes he's making is very high. I don't know if he will continue making mistakes. Let's hope that he continues making mistakes. But I think we are not making any mistake. We have a strategy. We have a manner of doing things. And I said to me that is the time that since I've been engaged in politics, a lot long ago, in which NATO and the European Union and NATO have reacted tougher, rapidly and continuously than any other occasion that I can remember.
Mr. Rasmussen, on May 31st, the EU agreed to ban most imports of Russian oil. Do you think it's enough? Can the EU do more?
I appreciate very much that the EU took the step to introduce an oil embargo. And while it's not 100%, it's an important step. But it is definitely not enough. It doesn't make sense that with the one hand, we are helping the Ukrainians with military stuff worth billions. And with the other hand, we are still pouring billions of euros into Putin's coffers to finance a war machine that destroys the weapon we are sending to Ukraine. That's really crazy. So I think next step should be to introduce a complete stop for all purchase of gas in Ukraine. It's of course more difficult than oil, an oil embargo, but it's doable. So let's look at the figures. Every year, the European Union imports 155 billion cubic meters of Russian gas. 155, that's a key figure. Okay, we have to replace 155 billion cubic meters. 70 billion could be replaced by LNG, liquefied natural gas. We have sufficient capacity, it's only a question of bringing it to Europe. That's 70. 60 billion could be replaced by saving the consumption by 10%. And it's doable. I mean, that's equivalent to diminishing the temperature in our houses 2 degrees and adapt in our industries, etc. That gives 60. So you have 70 plus 60, that's 130. Okay, 15 could be provided by new suppliers, like Norway, that could increase their supply, Algeria, that could increase their supply, that would give 15. Now we have 145. We're missing 10, and that could be that could come from a reduced storage capacity. Voila, that's 155. It's doable. Of course, it implies a lot of distribution in Europe, etc., etc. And it will come at a price. Obviously, we shouldn't be naive, but my point is, the price we are paying now will be much lower than the cost of continued war option in Ukraine. So that's why we should introduce a complete stop for purchase of Russian gas, not in 6 months, not in a year, but now. And I would say, I know it's a strong statement, but those who are opposed to stop pouring money into Putin's coffers are de facto complicit in his war crimes.
Professor de Hoop Scheffer, the latest figures show that with the sanctions against the oil, the price going up, President Putin has made $93 billion in oil, petrodollars, since the war started. That's more than he's spent there. What would you do, or what can be done to stop him from accessing those petrodollars?
Well, here we come to a complicated point, because if you discuss oil, by the way, I do agree with Anders Fogh Rasmussen on what he says about gas, but I'm simply wondering if the resilience of our democracies, and that's why I talked about inflation and invasion a moment ago, if our democracies are resilient enough. But that's another debate. What I would like to see, and what is not happening at the moment, is more coordination. And I come again to the European Union, not in the first place to NATO, about what's happening with the oil. And it's relevant for gas in the sense that we all know this discussion on Putin wanting us to pay in rubles. Some nations do, some companies do, others don't. And I think we really need more coordination, also from Brussels, because there is no level playing field at the moment, also not in the framework of the oil. And if oil is an example to gas, things go wrong. I mean, you all do it and you all adhere to what has been decided, or you don't. But you can't have it, and there are many NATO allies involved, of course, as well, that some pay in rubles, some others pay in dollars, which will then be converted into rubles, and others have business as usual. And politically, that is going to be a problem if we are not careful in that regard. So you are asking about Putin. It requires action from our side, and you know the oil ban is not complete. The Druzhba pipeline is exempted. I hope that the tanker insurance part of it is going to work, because Putin has to find other insurance for his oil tankers. There's a lot to do still. I mean, we have the oil sanctions package, but it is far from perfect and far from complete.
Dr. Solana, Pope Francis said yesterday that the Ukraine war, quote, perhaps was either provoked or not prevented. Do you agree with that statement? Was he wrong?
Well, I don't know what really means. I think that this war has not been provoked by anybody, and it has been prevented in a way that is what we can do in times in which we don't think it's going to be a situation like that. But provoke, that means because the things that happening in Ukraine, no. This is a war that's being created by the wish of President Putin. And that is what has to be our mantra. And no question at all on other things. The responsible for this war is President Putin.
Did NATO expand too quickly to the east, in your opinion?
Well, as you know, I was the one who started the opening of NATO. And I will never forget the moment in which I negotiated with the Russians, the founding act, and by we created a new body, was a Russian NATO Council, and we have done that document was signed by Russia and by NATO, and my signature is there, and President Yeltsin's signature is there, and. There is no reason whatsoever, because Ukraine is not part of NATO, Georgia is not part of NATO. Therefore, I think that this is decisions taken preventively in quotation marks by Putin, which are absolutely illegal. You cannot invade a country because you may think that eventually one day they can do anything wrong. Imagine if everybody will have this type of attitudes. This is incompatible with a serious international community. And President Putin today is not acting like a serious member of the international community with a big country. I distinguish very much between Russia and Putin. I love Russia. I detest at this point in time the behavior of Putin.
Mr. Rasmussen, was it a mistake to dangle NATO membership, if you will, to Georgia, offer it to Georgia and Ukraine, and then leave such a period of time that then allowed Putin to act the way he has acted?
Yes, seeing retrospectively, I think it was a big mistake that we did not grant Ukraine and Georgia the status and a membership action plan, it's called in technical language. They applied for a membership action plan back in 2008. We couldn't agree within NATO. I was in favor, the US president was in favor, but in particular, France and Germany were opposed to granting a membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia. So we couldn't, and we didn't. Instead, actually, we decided that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. And that's that's a stronger statement than the membership action plan. But Putin was furious. And 4 months after our summit in Bucharest 2008, he sent a clear message by attacking Georgia and de facto occupying Abkhazia and South Ossetia to Georgian regions. So I think it was a clear mistake because we sent a signal to Putin of division within NATO and weakness, and dictators do not respect weakness. They only respect unity and strength. So that should be the lesson learned from history. In 2014, the whole history was repeated when he took Crimea. Once again, we reacted too hesitantly, too mildly. Well, we introduced some sanctions, but it was not strong enough. So Putin concluded that he could, almost without any costs, continue his adventure in Ukraine. And now we are paying the price.
Lord Robertson, Turkey has threatened to block NATO membership for Finland and Sweden. Do they simply want F-16s? Do they want negotiations about the Kurds to continue? Is there more to Turkey's veto, if you will? And what can the alliance do about this?
Well, this is a really serious headache for the current Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, and I think all of us wish him well in the discussions that are going to take place. Turkey's always, been a prickly member of the alliance, but it's still a pivotal and an important one. Its geographic location, its military effectiveness make it absolutely essential. So we have to listen to what they say, but no one nation should be able to put a block on the application for membership of two countries that are so obviously going to add to NATO's strength. So I don't think I think my colleagues would want to try and second guess what Jens Stoltenberg is going to have to do in the next 2 weeks. There's going to be an element of bargaining involved in it, and all of us have been involved in bargaining with Turkey before. But I don't see Turkey as a very strong, proud member of NATO wanting to stand in the way of what is such a crucial and an important enlargement of the alliance at this point. Can I go back to some of the questions you asked before and what His Holiness the Pope has been saying this week? And I don't think he has been fully informed about the way in which NATO has enlarged. NATO has not expanded as if by some organic method. It expanded and enlarged by countries applying for membership, individual countries. Indeed, President Putin asked me when we were going to invite Russia to be invited into NATO, and I told him they would have to apply. He chose not to want to apply for NATO membership. But applications have to be made and applications have to be assessed. So I don't think actually the decision in 2008 was the cleverest decision we made, because it looked as if we were giving a shortcut to Ukraine and Georgia before they had actually completed the kind of transition that we had expected of all the other new countries that had joined NATO as well. But I'd also make this point that when President Putin complains about Georgia and Ukraine and the sentiments around there, this is all bogus, completely bogus. In my 4 years and 3 months as Secretary General of NATO, having 9 meetings with President Putin during that time, cordial, businesslike, he never complained about NATO enlargement once, not once. So rewriting history appears to be now part of his mission. But that bit of history, I can vouch for the fact he never objected during the whole of that period, and therefore anything else is a pure invention and genuinely scaremongering.
Wonderful. We are getting some wonderful questions coming in, so I'd like to read some to the group. From Jack Krupansky, some allies have asserted that NATO's goal should be strategic defeat for Russia. Is this realistic, or what should our objective be for the conflict? Is a stalemate more likely? Would one of you like to take that?
Yeah, I could comment on that. A few months ago, I wouldn't have imagined that a Ukrainian win would be a possibility. But today I have changed my mind. I'm a bit more optimistic. At least I think the Ukrainians can assure that Putin will not get away with a success in Ukraine. So I think the conclusion is the Ukrainians must win the war one way or the other, because Putin won't stop in Ukraine if he gets a success. His next goal would be Moldova, then Georgia, and eventually he might also put pressure on the three Baltic states. And that's why the Ukrainians are fighting on behalf of all of us. And that's why we have a duty to help them. In all respects, we are able to do.
Professor de Hoop Scheffer, Niels Larsen has a question. Several panelists have discussed the importance of strategic ambiguity. What circumstances would change this calculus to make a clearly defined response from NATO more effective? I think, for instance, of the use of chemical weapons, the use of nuclear weapons, the use of biological weapons. In what circumstances, perhaps, should strategic ambiguity not be the policy?
Well, as Lord Robertson said a moment ago, I think we should never make publicly clear how we would react, but that we would react, and that we have a lot of options. I remember, and you remember, President Biden, when the discussion was about chemical weapons, how would you react? And President Biden said we would react in kind. He meant proportionately. I think we should leave sufficient doubt. No doubt that we would react when the bridge to nuclear or weapons of mass destruction, I should say, is crossed. And let's come back to an earlier part of the discussion. Putin has more than once threatened to cross that bridge. It's in his doctrine: escalate to de-escalate. A low-yield nuclear weapon, well, a low-yield nuclear weapon, that's nice, but that's jargon. You cross a bridge which has not been crossed. But if that would happen, I consider it very improbable and unlikely, but the chance, of course, is not zero. And let me come back to my opinion that Putin is rational. If he is boxed in his rationality, he might, so the chance is not zero. And we had hoped that bridge would never be crossed. Our reaction should be the strategic ambiguity Lord Robertson was mentioning. And I think that certainly not our political leaders, but also we would not gain anything by speculating on how and what would happen. But that something would happen, that something very serious would happen, is crystal clear. But there are then, in such a situation, of course, many other options than reacting in kind. But reacting in kind should definitely not be excluded.
Admiral Stavridis has suggested recently that to break the siege of Odessa, that NATO warships should escort Ukrainian cargo ships to release the grain that the world is going to come to need very shortly, and the shortages are going to be felt very soon. Do you agree that NATO warships should open up that corridor and escort the Ukrainian cargo ships that are filled with grain?
I think before we go down that road of speculating, I think we need to understand what would be involved in that particular idea. The port of Odessa has been mined by both the Ukrainians and by the Russians. The demining operation could take a very, very long time before any cargo ship would be likely to safely be able to go into these waters. So, I'm sure Admiral Stavridis, who was a very clever and outstanding SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander in his day, would imagine that the new Supreme Allied Commander, who is about to be endorsed by the Senate, will be looking at all of these options, but he'll also be very well aware of the dangers that would be involved in doing it. The Ukrainians might be very reluctant to take away their mines because they may feel that that is the principal defense that the city of Odessa has at the present moment. it's a complicated thing, but I hope that General Javier, who is taking over at the moment as SACEUR, will examine the possibilities of that, fully recognizing that the inability to take the grain out in quantity is going to cause huge ripple effects across the global south, which will face famine if it doesn't get access to these stockpiles of grain that come from Ukraine. But I'm sure he'll be watching the complexities and the dangers, and I would hope that a wise decision is taken.
Mr. Rasmussen, Stephen Shapiro has a question. Your recent call to expand the Article 5 pledge to economic attacks is something that he says he's pushed for years as well. Can you elaborate on this and whether this could be undertaken within NATO, or should this be done by another organization like the EU?
Yeah, I don't think NATO is the right framework. Okay, I have suggested to introduce what I call an economic Article 5. Obviously, the idea is inspired by the NATO Article 5, which is a military article which states that an attack on one is considered an attack on all. And likewise, we should consider economic coercion against one country as an attack on all democratic nations across the world. Australia has experienced Chinese economic coercion. Lithuania has done exactly the same. And in each of those cases, I think the rest of the democratic world should come to the aid of those countries subject to such economic coercions by trading more, investing more, helping them in all respects. That's the idea behind an economic Article 5. Obviously, it's a bit more difficult. It's a bit more complicated to define what triggers an activation of an economic Article 5. But I think the main strength of an economic Article 5 is the deterrent effect. The world's free societies represent 60% of the global economy. If we stand together, if we are unified, then I think the Chinese, for instance, would think twice before they try economic coercion against a democracy. So I think such an article would rarely be activated. The mere existence of it would be a strong deterrence.
Speaking of China, Dr. Solana, do you think that Asia needs a NATO-like alliance?
Well, I think it's for the Asians to decide how they want to defend from a potential attacker. The European Union is far from that part of the world. NATO is far from that part of the world, but we can discuss with them the benefits of having an organization like NATO that are good for the member states and good for the peace in the world. But I don't think that we have to define how Asian countries should defend themselves.
Professor de Hoop Scheffer, another question, this one from Ian Bond from the Center for European Reform. President Macron has spoken about putting military industry on a war footing to increase production of what equipment can be transferred to Ukraine. Could NATO be involved identifying production needs and coordinating the industrial effort?
NATO could certainly be involved in identifying production needs, and I think it's a highly relevant question, because we have discussed arms deliveries to Ukraine, but given our geopolitical holiday, I mean, some nations, including mine, the Netherlands, at a certain stage have depleted their stocks. So it's absolutely necessary that production is increased. And NATO could play a very useful role in identifying where and when that would be. I do not think we should NATO-wise this discussion, like the weapons deliveries to Ukraine, of course, are have full support politically by NATO, but we talk about the NATO allies in delivering those weapons to Ukraine. But the principle and the remarks of President Macron are right in the sense that we do indeed need to do more, and certainly not come into a position that our stocks have been depleted while Ukraine is on a tipping point, if you understand what I mean.
As we get to the end of this fascinating discussion in this hour, there are two questions that came in that are quite similar, and I'll open it up to the group. From Ross Davey, what does success look like for Ukraine? Is it a return to the February 23rd status quo or something else, pre-2014, for instance? Similarly, from Ahmed Uzumshu, what do you foresee as NATO's policy towards Russia after the war ends? Who would like to take that?
I have two wishes, at least, for the NATO summit by the end of this month. Firstly, a decision to establish permanent NATO bases in the East, in the Baltic states, in Poland, maybe also in Romania. We have so far refrained from it, but I think the new security situation requires a permanent stationing of NATO troops in the East to strengthen our territorial defense. And secondly, I hope we could send a clear message to Putin. Mr. Putin, there is one way out of the mess you have created. That way is out of Ukraine.
We have 3 minutes left and 3 panelists left. I'd like to ask you, looking ahead to the 2022 summit in Madrid, what message does NATO need to convey to Vladimir Putin? And I'd like to also suggest something I've heard a lot of late, that the slow movement of weapons into Ukraine that have been stymied by logistical problems, that it is perhaps the West is nursing the conflict as opposed to giving Ukraine what it needs to win. I'd like to get your response. If you'd like to start, Dr. Solana.
Yes, I go the second part, so the second one. I think it would be very unfair to say that the fact that the weapons are not arriving as fast as necessary, that we are fighting, we are the gain in our obligation. No. I mean, the amount of weapons that are coming from the countries that I know, I don't know what every country is doing, but I know several, almost everyone, they are doing an effort that never before have done. And they have been to take changes in their parliaments, voting in their parliaments in order to do that. And they are doing it today, yesterday, the day before. That's a big effort what is doing, and it should be recognized. I do recognize that effort. It is the first time that I see an effort of this nature being done in NATO, and I have been connected to NATO for the last century.
May I add that the NATO summit should have one clear message. We are in full political agreement on what we should achieve in Ukraine. That's one. And two, as important, it's about the resilience of our democracies. Our political leaders, NATO's political leaders, all politics is local after all, should convince their constituents that yes, inflation and an economic crisis and rising prices are important, but that on the European continent, there's a horrible war going on. So yes, it's inflation, but it is also invasion, and that should be a crystal clear message to Putin.
Lord Robertson, 30 seconds left. What would the message to Putin be at the summit in your eyes?
The message is solidarity, unity, and determination. The Ukrainian people must win, and they must be the ones who decide what winning is actually about. When I went to NATO, my first day, I said I had 3 objectives. It was capabilities, capabilities, capabilities. For the NATO summit is weapons, 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 and a free democratic Ukraine.
I want to thank all of our fascinating former Secretaries General for joining us today. It's been an amazing discussion. I'm delighted to have been a part of it. To our viewers online, thank you for joining us today and for your questions. They were excellent. If you're interested in learning more, I invite you to stay engaged with the Atlantic Council and their programming leading up to the NATO Summit at the end of this month. And in particular, stay tuned for another Atlantic Council front page that you won't want to miss tomorrow, the Prime Minister of Lithuania at 1 p.m. Eastern. Until next time, thank you for joining us.